it because that's not things that people are looking for normally in a source code review. It's looking for other syntactical errors and lack of input validation and things of that nature. So it was pretty evident from that there was a backdoor. It was someone who had access to the code who was able to inject this code in there. And who could it have been? So we started, we knew it was a backdoor. We started looking at the code archives to detect when was this piece of code actually put in there. So we started looking at all the different versions and try to figure out who checked this piece of code in. What we found was that the piece of code was checked in by one of the developers who was contracted, an offshore developer, that they had contracted from a third party in Asia. It was his username associated with the code check-in. And then what was even more interesting is we said, well, now that we know to look for this fifth parameter in the URL called let me in, we can go back to the web server log files and start searching through them and see if it occurs in there. So we did that. We went back in there. And of course, we found that parameter in there. Well, guess what? The source IP address, it wasn't even masked. They didn't even jump through different hops. The source IP came from the same country from where this developer was from. And some geolocation pointed us in pretty much an accurate geographic location of the third-party development shop in Asia. So the pieces of the puzzle were kind of coming together where it was fairly evident that this developer in this offshore development shop injected the backdoor, and in a lot of these low-cost centers, $250,000 is a lot of money, and people can have a very good life with that. So I probably thought it's worth my while just to put this little backdoor in and get settled for life. So we actually notified the development company right away. Most cases were not very, when we perform incident response and we cross international boundaries, we're not very optimistic about the outcome. But in this case, actually, law enforcement was very cooperative at the other end, and was almost like in a Hollywood flick action kind of thing where they got a hold of the person, and we were able to thwart this attack in under those 72 hours. So it was definitely very movie-like. So any questions on this case study before I move on? All right, yeah. Sure, exactly, and that's what I'm going to get to is, this is not just bashing on an offshore developer. This could have been done by a developer in-house. So the next few slides here, I'm going to discuss, what the differences were and some of the things to look out for. Any other questions on this particular case study? Yeah. Right. I guess he's pretty forgiving here, where he says, it could have been a test function that was embedded in source code and someone forgot about it. Sure, there's no doubt about that. It could have been that. And there was a bunch of other select stars in there which were of that nature, actually, because, it's like, why are they writing these select stars and pulling out the entire database table? But obviously, in this case, it was very evident what was going on, given especially that the web server logs had that exact entry in there, and then the extortion followed soon thereafter. So it was pretty evident that it wasn't something unintentional that was left in there. It was a very intentional backdoor that had been created. All right, we'll get to that in a second. So in terms of legalities, is that evidence sufficient enough? And when I started off the talk, I said, if you don't have your proactive measures put in place correctly in terms of legalities, SLAs, and other things which we'll discuss here shortly, the only person who have a good time and make a lot of money is lawyers. And that's exactly what was going on here. You had a question? All right, so right, well, okay, well, let's hold on to that question for 1 second. So the question is, should you not have in your contract with the offshore or outsourced shop that they should actually perform some sort of security testing, and would such a scan have actually caught that? That's exactly what I was kind of getting to. So there's a security divide that I've seen between companies in the US or in the developed nations that outsource and offshore, and those across the Atlantic and the Pacific, depending on which way you look at it. A lot of it is to do with SLAs and legalities, and I'm not a lawyer, but I'll have a brief discussion about that. Obviously, about security being built into the SDLC, there are some very distinct challenges that I'll pose out here, and if I can get some, we'll probably get a debate going on that. And then talking about security acceptance criteria, well, like when you do get code back, how do you make sure that there's appropriate criteria in place which have been already presented to the development shop, saying this is what we're going to test your code against. It's not just all about performance. When it does come to SLAs and legalities, there's a lot of pitfalls that we see from this end, which is often security vulnerabilities aren't even defined. So, to the point that he brought up here, someone can just say, how do you differentiate between a software bug and a security vulnerability? If you think about it from a legal standpoint, it can become a pretty gray area to do that. And if you started saying every software bug was a security vulnerability and you're liable for it, Microsoft wouldn't exist. So, there's a balance there when you're actually outsourcing development to be able to define, and I know Owasp actually has some pretty good guidelines on outsourcing and how to set those agreements in place. Documenting your requirements, just, whether going back to, how is this different from if you did it in-house or not. Most of the times I've seen, at least large financial institutions and such in the US, they have pretty stringent processes for their software development in-house, libraries that are used for specific purposes, and there's a process in place. When things get offshored or outsourced, there's oftentimes that there's holes created in those processes because there's a feeling like, well, the software development is now the job of that company. And because of that, there's a lot of security requirements are not really introduced in the requirements document. It's like, this is what we need from a functionality standpoint, and get it to us yesterday. Well, security doesn't make that cut. Those developers don't care about the security of your organization. They're just going to develop what they're paid for. So it's not always right to point the finger at them. There's a lot of blame to be borne by the companies that offshore and outsource as well. One of the critical things is that defining acceptance criteria, like I said. Well, you can define acceptance criteria for functionality and performance and say if the code that you provide us at the end of the day is not functional or doesn't perform to these metrics, we're not going to accept it and you're going to have to fix that. Well, how come that doesn't happen with security? And oftentimes it doesn't. So, if that's the case, from a legal standpoint, that offshore shop is not really liable because it wasn't a part of their requirements, wasn't a part of the acceptance criteria. They're not liable to give you secure code because you didn't ask for it. And finally, one of the things that I've noticed also goes wrong often, and I've seen this with a lot of firms in the US, and I always tell them that, watch that jurisdiction in the contract verbiage. In the contract language, you'll often find people, if the outsourced firm sends you the contract, they're talking about dispute resolution in their country of residence. I mean, are your lawyers going to be flying out to a developing nation and trying to fight a case on code not being secure? Forget about it. It's probably going to be 25 years before it comes up for hearing. So the jurisdiction is another major issue to watch out for, and I often see that slipping, and again, it's just lawyers partying from there. But another big question is who foots the bill for this? It's all nice to talk about it and say there needs to be security, so on and